The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty main street of Willow Creek when Martha Henderson stepped out of her bakery, flowers still dusting her worn apron. She had risen before dawn as she had every day for the past 3 years, kneading dough and stoking ovens while the world slept. The familiar ache in her lower back reminded her of the countless hours she spent, bent over her work. But it was honest work, the kind that kept her hands busy and her heart from dwelling too long on what she'd lost. At 28, the weathered hands of a woman who'd known hardship, but her green eyes still held a warmth that drew people to her small shop. She'd arrived in Willow Creek with nothing but a carpet bag and a recipe book that had belonged to her grandmother, fleeing a past she rarely spoke of. The townspeople had accepted her quiet presence, grateful for the fresh bread and sweet rolls that filled their mornings with comfort. As she arranged the day's loaves in her storefront window, Martha noticed a small figure huddled near the horse trough across the street. A child no more than 10 years old, with matted brown hair and clothes that hung like rags from his thin frame. She'd seen him before, always watching, always hungry, always alone. The boy's eyes met hers through the glass, and she saw something that made her chest tighten. It wasn't just hunger she recognized, but a deep, hollow loneliness that she knew all too well. Without hesitation, Martha selected the largest, warmest loaf from her display and stepped outside. "You there?" she called softly, not wanting to startle him. "Are you hungry?" The boy tensed as if ready to run, but the smell of fresh bread held him in place. He nodded once, barely perceptible. Martha approached slowly, the way one might approach a wounded animal, when she was close enough. She knelt down and offered him the loaf. "What's your name, child?" he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. "Well, Tommy, this bread is yours. And if you come by tomorrow morning, there'll be more." The boy's eyes widened in disbelief. He clutched the bread to his chest as if it might disappear, mumbling a barely audible thank you before disappearing. Into the maze of alleys behind the buildings, Martha watched him go, her heart heavy with recognition. She knew what it was like to be lost, to feel as though the world had forgotten you existed. 3 years ago she had been running too, though from different demons than those that chased a hungry orphan through the streets. The rest of the day passed as usual. Customers came and went. Coins changed hands, and Martha lost herself in the rhythm of her work. But as evening fell and she prepared to close the shop, her mind kept returning to the boy's hollow eyes. She found herself setting aside extra bread for the morning,
along with some cheese
and a jar of preserves. That night, Martha's dreams were restless. She found herself back in the elegant parlors of her father's house in Charleston, wearing silk gowns instead of flour-dusted aprons. In her dreams, she was 19 again, young and foolish and desperately in love with a man her father would never accept, James. McKinnon had been everything her father despised, a poor Irish stable hand with calloused hands and dreams bigger than his station. But to Martha, he had been everything beautiful in the world. They had met in secret for months, stealing kisses in moonlit gardens and making promises they believed would last forever. The dream always ended the same way, with her father's thunderous voice declaring that she would marry Preston Whitmore, a wealthy plantation owner's son, or be cut off from the family forever. She could still feel the weight of the decision that had torn her heart in two: love or security, passion or survival. She had chosen security, as her father knew she would. But on the morning of her wedding to Preston, something inside her had broken. She couldn't do it. She couldn't spend her life with a man she didn't love, while the one who held her heart worked in the stables. Believing she had chosen wealth over their love, so she had run. In her wedding dress, she had climbed out of her bedroom window and disappeared into the pre-dawn darkness, leaving behind everything she had ever known. The years since had been hard learning to work with her hands, to survive on her own strength, to build a life from nothing, but they had also been honest years, and she had found a kind of peace in the simple act of feeding people, of providing comfort one loaf at a time. Martha woke with tears on her cheeks and the familiar ache in her chest that came whenever she allowed herself to remember what she had lost. James was probably married now, she told herself, as she had 1,000 times before. He had probably forgotten the girl who had broken his heart and disappeared without explanation. The next morning arrived gray and drizzling, but Martha was at her usual post early, watching for Tommy. She had prepared a small bundle of food wrapped in clean cloth, enough to keep a growing boy fed for several days. But as the morning wore on, Tommy didn't appear. Instead, something else caught her attention, a sound like distant thunder, growing steadily louder. Martha stepped outside and shaded her eyes, looking down the muddy main street toward the edge of town. What she saw made her heart stop. Horses, hundreds of them, ridden by women dressed in simple riding clothes, their faces set with determination. They moved as one unit, disciplined and purposeful, like an army marching to war. At their head rode a woman with silver-streaked hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command. The townspeople had begun to emerge from their shops and homes, drawn by the sound of hoofbeats. Children pressed their faces to windows, while men stepped protectively in front of their families. Willow Creek was a peaceful town, unaccustomed to such displays of force. The riders came to a halt in the center of town, their horses snorting and stamping in the sudden silence. The woman at their head dismounted with fluid grace and looked around until her eyes fixed on Martha's bakery. "I'm looking for the woman who gave bread to a hungry child yesterday," she called out, her voice carrying clearly through the still air. "Martha Henderson, I believe." Martha's hands trembled as she stepped forward, her mind racing. How could this woman know her name? How could she know about Tommy? "I'm Martha Henderson," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. The woman smiled, and suddenly her stern features transformed into something warm and maternal. "My name is Eleanor McKinnon," she said, and Martha's world tilted on its axis. "I believe you knew my son James some years ago in Charleston." The blood drained from Martha's face. McKinnon, James's mother. But how was that possible? James had told her his mother was dead, killed when he was just a boy. He mourned with him, held him as he wept for the woman he had lost. "I can see you're confused, dear," Eleanor continued, her voice gentle now. "Perhaps we should talk privately. Ladies," she turned to address the mounted women behind her, "please make camp outside of town. We'll be staying the night." As the riders began to move off, Martha noticed for the first time that these weren't just any women. They carried themselves with the confidence of those who had faced hardship and emerged stronger. Their clothes were practical but well-made, their horses healthy and well-trained. This was no ragtag group of wanderers. "Mrs. McKinnon," Martha began, but Eleanor held up a hand. "Please, call me Eleanor. And yes, I know what my son told you about me. It was necessary at the time, for reasons I hope to explain. But first, might we go inside? I have much to tell you, and I fear it's a story that will require sitting down." Martha led Eleanor into her small bakery, her mind reeling with questions. She poured coffee with shaking hands, while Eleanor settled herself at the small table Martha used for her bookkeeping. "The boy you helped yesterday," Eleanor began without preamble. "His name is Thomas McKinnon. He's my grandson James's son." Martha's coffee cup clattered against the saucer. "James has a son?" had Eleanor corrected gently. "James died 2 years ago, fighting in a range war down in Texas. He never married, Martha. He carried your memory with him until the day he died." The room seemed to spin around Martha. James was dead. The man she had loved, had dreamed of, had built her life around the memory of gone. And he had never married, never moved on, as she had imagined. "The boy," she managed to whisper. "If James never married." "Thomas is the son of a woman James loved briefly after. After you left, she died giving birth to him, and James raised the boy alone. When James died, Thomas came to me, but he's been having a hard time. He runs away frequently, always searching for something he can't name." Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes intense. "Yesterday, when he came back to our camp outside of town, he was different. For the first time in 2 years, he smiled. He told me about a kind woman who gave him bread, who looked at him like he mattered. He said she had the greenest eyes he'd ever seen, just like his father always talked about." Martha's breath caught. James had remembered her eyes. "You see, my dear, James never stopped talking about you. Even as he lay dying, your name was on his lips. He made me promise that if I ever found you, I would tell you the truth about why he let you believe I was dead. about why he never came after you, about how much he loved you until his last breath. Why? Martha whispered. Why did he lie about you? Eleanor's face hardened with old pain. Because I was the reason your father discovered your relationship. I had come to Charleston looking for work, and I made the mistake of asking about my son at your father's stable. Your father put the pieces together quickly enough. He threatened to have James arrested for theft, a crime he didn't commit but couldn't disprove. The only way to protect James was for me to disappear, to become dead to him. Martha felt as though she were drowning. All these years she had believed James had hidden their relationship out of shame, lied about his mother out of embarrassment. But he had been protecting the woman who had given him life, sacrificing his own happiness to keep her safe. He watched you marry Preston Whitmore, Eleanor continued relentlessly. He was there, hidden in the crowd, when you walked down that aisle. But then, miracle of miracles, you ran. James saw you climb out of that window, saw you disappear into the dawn, and he knew you had chosen love after all. He spent 3 years looking for you, Martha. It's 3 years traveling from town to town, following every lead, chasing every rumor. Then why didn't he find me? Martha's voice broke on the words. Because you had covered your tracks too well. Had become someone else entirely. By the time he tracked Martha Henderson to Willow Creek, you had already been here 2 years, and he had given up the search. He had met Thomas's mother by then, and though he never loved her the way he loved you, he cared for her. When she died, he threw himself into raising his son and fighting other people's battles. Eleanor reached across the table and took Martha's hands in her weathered ones. He never stopped loving you, child, never stopped hoping that someday, somehow he would find you again, and in a way he has. Through his son, Martha was crying now, great silent tears that fell into her lap. 3 years of wondering, of imagining James happy with someone else, of building a life around the belief that their love had been nothing more than youthful folly. And all the while he had been searching for her, carrying her memory like a torch in the darkness. The women outside, Martha said through her tears. Who are they? Eleanor smiled proudly. Widows, most of them. Women who lost their men to war, to violence, to the hardships of frontier life. James helped many of them. When their husbands died, gave them work on the ranch he eventually built, protected them when others would have taken advantage. When I told them about you, about what you meant to James, they insisted on coming. They want to honor his memory by protecting what he loved most. I don't understand. Thomas needs a mother, Martha, and you, you need a son. James saw that, even from beyond the grave. When Thomas described you yesterday, I knew. James had described you 1,000 times, not just your green eyes, but your kindness, your strength, the way you see straight to the heart of what people need. Martha stared at Eleanor, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. You want me to take Thomas? I want you to love him, Eleanor said simply. The way you would have loved James's children if things had been different. The way James would. Want a son to be loved? That afternoon, Eleanor brought Thomas to the bakery. The boy was clean now, his hair washed and combed, wearing clothes that actually fit his small frame. But his eyes still held that hollow wariness that had caught Martha's attention the day before. Thomas, Eleanor said gently. This is Martha. Henderson, she's the lady who gave you bread yesterday. Thomas nodded but didn't speak, his eyes fixed on the floor. Martha knelt down to his level, just as she had the day before. Hello, Thomas. Would you like to help me bake something? For the first time, the boy looked up at her directly. My PA used to help his ma bake, he said quietly. Before she died, he told me about it. Martha's heart clenched. What did he tell? You, he said. She made the best bread in the whole world. She had green eyes, like spring grass. Thomas studied her face carefully. Your eyes are green like that. Your father sounds like he was a very special man, it was Thomas said. With quiet conviction, said someday he was going to find the lady with green eyes again, and we'd all live together and be happy. But then he died. Martha looked up at Eleanor, seeing her own tears reflected in the older woman's eyes. This child had been carrying his father's broken dreams, searching for the woman James had described to him in bedtime stories. Thomas. Martha said carefully. "Would you like to stay here with me for a while? I could teach you to bake bread, and you could help me in the shop." The boy's eyes widened. "Forever? If you want to? If it feels right to both of us?" Thomas looked at his grandmother, who nodded encouragingly. Then he looked back at Martha with something that might have been hope beginning to flicker in his young face. "Can I call you Ma?" he asked in a whisper. Martha's answer came in the form of arms that opened wide, gathering the small boy against her heart. As Thomas buried his face in her shoulder, she felt something broken inside her begin to heal. This wasn't the life she had dreamed of with James, but it was the legacy of their loved child who needed exactly what she had to give. That evening, the women made camp just outside of town, their cook fires twinkling like stars in the gathering dusk. Martha walked among them with Thomas at her side, listening to their stories, understanding at last why they had come so far to see her. There was Sarah, whose husband had died in the war, leaving her with 4 children and a failing farm. James had given her work as a cook on his ranch. There was Maria, whose husband had been killed by cattle rustlers, and who now ran the general store James had helped her buy. There was Rebecca, barely older than Martha herself, whose husband had died of fever, who had found purpose teaching the children on James's ranch to read and write. Each woman had a story of loss, of desperation, of being lifted up by a man who understood what it meant to be alone in the world. They had loved James not as a romantic figure, but as a brother, a protector, a beacon of hope in their darkest hours. "Talked about you so much," Sarah told Martha as they sat around the fire. "Always said when he found his green-eyed girl, he was going to bring her to meet all of us. Said we'd love you just like he did." "He was right," Rebecca added, bouncing Thomas on her knee. "Anyone who sees this boy the way you do, who opens her heart without question, that's the kind of woman James would choose." As the night deepened and the stories continued, Martha began to understand the true scope of what James had built in the years after she left Charleston. He had created not just a ranch, but a community, a place where lost souls could find belonging, where love took many forms, where family was defined not by blood but by choice. "There's something else," Eleanor said as the fire burned low.
"The ranch."
"James left it to Thomas, but it's being held in trust until he comes of age. The women you've met tonight, they run it now, collectively. It's a good life, Martha Hart. Work, but honest. There would be a place for you there if you wanted it. A place for both of you." Martha looked down at Thomas, who had fallen asleep against her side. In one day, her entire world had changed. She had gained a son, learned the truth about the man she had never stopped loving, and been offered a future she had never dared to imagine. But there was something else. Something that went deeper than the practical arrangements of where to live and how to make a life. There was the sense that this was meant to be, that all the pain and separation and wandering had led to this moment, to this child who needed her, to this community of women who understood what it meant to build something beautiful from the ashes of loss. The next morning brought farewells and promises to write. The women would return to the ranch, but they would be back for Christmas. They declared, to see how Thomas was settling in, to make sure Martha had everything she needed. As the riders disappeared into the morning haze, Martha and Thomas stood in front of the bakery, watching until the last horse was out of sight. Then Thomas looked up at her with eyes that were beginning to lose their hollow look. "Ma," he said, testing out the word again, "will you teach me to make bread like my PA said his ma used to make?" Martha smiled, her heart full to bursting. "I'll teach you everything I know, sweetheart. Maybe someday you can teach your own children." They went inside together, and Martha began to show Thomas how to measure flour, how to work the dough, how to feel when it was ready for the oven. As they worked side by side, she told him stories about his father, not the painful truths about separation and loss, but the beautiful memories of a young man with laughing eyes and gentle hands, who had taught her that love was worth any sacrifice. Months passed, and Thomas flourished under Martha's care. He learned to bake, but more than that, he learned to trust, to hope, to believe that he was worthy of love and belonging. His laughter filled the small bakery, and his presence gave Martha a purpose she had never known she needed. The women from the ranch visited as promised, bringing news and friendship and the constant reminder that Martha and Thomas were part of something larger than themselves. They brought word that the ranch was thriving, that the community James had built was growing stronger, that his legacy lived on in every life he had touched. On the first anniversary of Thomas coming to live with her, Martha made a decision. She sold the bakery to a young couple who had recently arrived in town, packed their few belongings, and prepared to leave Willow Creek behind. "Are you sure about this, Ma?" Thomas asked, as they loaded their things into the wagon Eleanor had sent for them. Martha looked around at the town that had been her refuge for so many years, at the place where she had learned to stand on her own and build a life. From nothing, it had served its purpose. She was ready now for something more, ready to be part of the community James had envisioned, ready to help raise the child he had loved, ready to honor the man who had never stopped believing in the power of love, to triumph over any obstacle. "I'm sure," she told Thomas, lifting him up onto the wagon seat beside her. "We're going home." The journey to the ranch took 3 days, winding through prairie grass and rolling hills, past streams that sparkled in the sunlight and groves of trees that provided cool shade during the heat of the day. Thomas chattered excitedly about what their new home would be like, about the other children he would meet, about the horses he would learn to ride. But as they crested the final hill and saw the ranch spread out below them, both of them fell silent in wonder. It was beautiful, not grand, in the way of her father's plantation. It's beautiful in its simplicity, its obvious love and care. The house was large but comfortable, built of native stone and timber, with wide porches that invited lingering. Gardens flourished around it, tended by loving hands. Corrals held sleek horses, and children played in the yard while women worked at various tasks, their easy camaraderie evident even from a distance. "Pa built this?" Thomas asked in awe. "Your father built this," Martha confirmed, her voice thick with emotion. This was what James had done with his life after losing her. He had created a place where love could flourish, where broken hearts could heal, where family was not about blood, but about choice and commitment and daily acts of kindness. Eleanor met them at the gate, her face glowing with happiness at their arrival. The other women gathered around, welcoming them with hugs and laughter and tears of joy. Children who had heard stories about Thomas rushed to meet him, eager to show him the barn and the horses and the swimming hole hidden in the trees. Evening, as the community gathered for dinner in the large communal hall James had built, Martha felt a peace settle over her that she had never known before. This was what love looked like when it was allowed to grow beyond the boundaries of romance, when it became a force that transformed not just a hearts but an entire community. After dinner, Eleanor walked with Martha to a small rise behind the house where a simple stone marker stood among wildflowers. James McKinnon, it read. Beloved son, father, and friend. He built a place where love could grow. He would be so proud, Eleanor said softly, of Thomas, of you, of what you've already brought to this place just by being here, and placed her hand on the stone, feeling the warmth that had absorbed from the day's sunlight. I love you, she whispered, speaking to the man who had shaped her heart, who had given her the greatest gift of all in his son, who had shown her that love was not just about holding on, but sometimes about letting go, trusting that what was meant to be would find its way. Behind her, she could hear Thomas's laughter, mixing with the voices of his new friends. And she knew that James's dream had finally come true. Not in the way any of them had imagined, but in the way that mattered most, through love that transcended death, through sacrifice that created new life, through the understanding that sometimes the greatest love stories are not about two people finding each other, but about the love that ripples out from their connection, touching lives they never even knew existed. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Martha rose and walked back toward the house, toward the warm light, spilling from its windows, toward the sound of Thomas calling her name. She was home at last, not in the place she had expected, but in the place where she was needed most, where love had led her through loss and longing to find the life she was always meant to live, the dirty orphan who had wandered into her bakery, That day had given her more than she could ever have imagined, not just a son to love, but a connection to the man who had never stopped loving her, a place in a community built on the revolutionary idea that love, when shared freely, has the power to transform the world. Under the vast western sky, surrounded by the family she had found in the legacy of the love she had lost, Martha Henderson finally understood that some stories don't end with a kiss or a wedding or a reunion. Some stories end with the quiet recognition that love, real love, never truly ends at all. It just changes form, creates new patterns, builds new homes and hearts that are willing to remain open to its transformative power. The bread she had given to a hungry child had returned to her multiplied 100-fold, in the form of belonging, purpose, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that love once planted grows in ways beyond imagination, touching lives across time and distance, creating connections that death itself cannot sever. As she tucked Thomas into his new bed in their new home, Martha smiled at the boy who had brought her back to life. Tomorrow, they would wake up in a house built by love, surrounded by a community sustained by love, living the legacy of a love that had been tested by separation but had ultimately triumphed through sacrifice and faith. It was, she realized, the most beautiful love story of all.